All right, this is the final section of our look at Chapter 13 of the peripheral nervous system in our human anatomy and physiology text. In this section, we'll be putting kind of in more discrete terms something I've been talking about since back in Chapter 12 about the way the motor cortex kind of interacts with the basal nuclei and the cerebellum to forge and fine-tune motor plans that then can be executed by the primary motor cortex down onto lower motor neurons of the somatic motor division. Boy, that was a mouthful, right? You'll see what I mean. We're going to add a little bit to that story as well, because we're going to talk about something called the segmental level of motor control that has to do with the spinal cord, and we haven't talked about that before. All right, here's a wonderful diagram showing the different levels of motor control, somatic motor control. This top box represents our discussion of the cerebral cortex and the basal nuclei and cerebellum, again from Chapter 12. So the cerebellum and basal nuclei are the sort of overseers of everything. The premotor cortex can start to form a motor plan based on our goals for moving our body. The cerebellum and basal nuclei are going to really fine-tune that plan and then control its execution. So they're up here at the top, the highest level of control. Then those plans are going to be sent down. Those descending pathways are just called the projection level. That information is going to be sent down through the primary motor neurons, the pyramidal neurons, as well as some neurons from the red nuclei in the vestibular center and so forth. It helps us keep our balance and maintain our posture. So all those descending pathways are the projection level. And finally, we'll talk about the segmental level. Some things are wired or automated in the spinal cord with respect to motor control. All right. So again, the premotor cortex gets wind of our goal to move our body and starts developing a plan for controlling the skeletal muscles, the timing and the order and the pattern. The cerebellum and basal nuclei provide the detailed fine-tuning instructions. That's because the cerebellum keeps track of all the proprioceptor information about the musculoskeletal system. So these two sections help really produce the final motor plans and then execute those plans. What do I mean by that? Well, the cerebellum and the basal nuclei both are involved in fine-tuning the actual plan, so they are the last word in what is the sequence of muscle contractions going to be, what is the timing of those muscle contractions going to be. And they actually send that information back up to the motor cortex, which is then executed through the primary motor cortex. Well, we already know that the basal nuclei are involved in starting and stopping movements, right? They block unwanted movements. They hold everything still until we're ready to issue our plan, and then they initiate the execution of the plan, and then when it's finished, they stop everything. So a lot of movement-related function in the basal nuclei. Also, these highest command level centers coordinate the movements that we plan to do with posture and balance, center of gravity, which is information partly derived from the vestibular apparatus, which we haven't talked about yet, but the balance center in the inner ears. All right, of course you know that the cerebellum has that proprioceptor information. Again, the projection level is just the descending pathways. Upper motor neurons, the pyramidal neurons of the primary motor cortex, descend right down the spinal cord to the lower motor neurons, which will then control the skeletal muscles. There's also brainstem motor areas, the red nuclei we talked about as being able to control skeletal muscles, and they have a role in controlling reflexes and other spinal cord motor functions. It turns out that the reflexes we're going to talk about in a second, they're simple, and we describe them in a very simple way, but they're actually sort of the sort of sensitivity or reactivity of those reflexes is controlled in the brainstem from above. In other words, if you have a spinal cord injury, it's going to turn out that a lot of the reflexes in the spinal cord kind of go off the deep end because they're no longer being controlled from above in terms of sensitivity. All right. let's talk about the segmental level, the lowest level of motor control. Well, it turns out that when you want to move your body in a particular way, the complex series and timing of muscle contraction does not have to be entirely specified in the cortex or the cerebrum and in the basal nuclei and the cerebellum. Some more generalized commands can be sent down through the projection pathways, and then there's automated circuits in the spinal cord that can handle some of the details of the patterns of muscle contraction control. Central pattern generators are circuits in the spinal cord that take over automation of some of the groups of muscle contractions. Pretty cool stuff. A lot of oft-repeated motor activities, such as some aspects of walking, for example, are controlled automatically by central pattern generators in the spinal cord. So here we have the highest level of control, the cerebellum and primary basal nuclei that know how to fine-tune and give the last word in the actual motor plan, and then execute that by way of the premotor cortex onto the primary motor cortex, starting and stopping that process and getting everything, the timing all correct. Then the information, the impulses go traveling down through the projection levels, down through the spinal cord to the lower motor neurons, but actually not directly. They go down to pattern generators in the spinal cord, which then actually end up terminating at the lower motor neurons and activating the skeletal muscles. So now we have motor output. Interestingly, when that happens, there's always feedback going to the highest command levels. When the information goes down through the projection level, there's also the map of information, the map of motor control goes right back to the highest levels to reformulate it. Right? They dish it out and then they get a copy back to fine-tune with the assistance of the sensory divisions. Right? We take a look and see how things are coming along. And we look at the proprioceptors, but as well as somatic sensors and special sensors in order to give feedback that will help guide the instruction and fine-tune the instruction and improve the instruction to make sure that we wind up with a successful completion of the movements. And just another way of looking at these centers. Here's the primary motor cortex. The pyramidal neurons are here. The premotor cortex here begins to hatch a plan, gets in touch with the basal nuclei and cerebellum, which really produce the final motor plan, which is then sent back by way of the thalamus to the motor cortex for execution. Here are some brainstem nuclei that assist with making sure that we keep our balance and keep our posture the way we want it as we're executing the motor plan. Sensory inputs come back up here to the somatosensory cortex and the cerebellum and help us continually rework the motor plan and rework and re-execute until we finally complete the task. All right, enough about motor control. Let's talk about reflexes. Now, reflexes are something that we already talked about in labs. So we don't need to spend a ton of time on it, but it's fascinating. Some reflexes are built in. You're born with them. Rapid, involuntary responses to certain types of stimuli. Posture control reflexes. Reflexes associated with visceral activity in your body you don't know anything about, but also some spinal reflexes. Reflexes can be acquired, learned through practice, or modified or improved through practice. For example, driving skills, there's a bunch of fun reflexes that you can teach yourself. If you look online, you can find some examples of acquired reflexes. One of the favorite ones I remember growing up was to have someone hold their hand out and as if to grasp something and then hold a dollar bill just above their outstretched index fingers and ring finger or middle finger and thumb, and then drop that bill and see if they could learn to quickly enough close their fingers to catch that note before it passed through their grasp. So a reflex arc contains, at minimum, a sensory neuron, right, that can be acted upon by a certain type of stimulus, some integration center, the spinal cord typically, but it can also be the motor cortex or the brainstem, a motor neuron to control the skeletal muscle or whatever output we're going to activate, a gland or a smooth muscle it could be also, and an effector, the actual target of the motor neuron. So here's a cartoon that we saw before. Sensory neuron receiving stimulation. Impulses travel to the spinal cord in this unipolar sensory neuron. Integration happening here, either with or without an interneuron, or interneurons, depending on the reflex, and a motor neuron to activate the effector and make some response. This is the automated response we're talking about. Somatic reflexes involve the skeletal muscles, even though they're voluntary muscles. In this case, they're going to be activated involuntarily. And then there are autonomic reflexes that operate your digestive tract, for example, and smooth muscle and glands and your heart and so forth. Spinal somatic reflexes. The integration happens in the spinal cord typically. The effectors of the skeletal muscle, somatic reflexes, right? They're often tested clinically for determining the overall state or function of the nervous system. If the reflexes are exaggerated, that could mean that there's no longer a pathway coming from above, from the brainstem, to sort of keep those reflexes dampened down and under control. If they're absent, that could mean there's injury to one of the pathways, sensory or motor pathways of the spinal cord itself. Overall nervous system, for example, could be affected and suppressed, and therefore no reflex. Proprioceptors are involved in reflexes, the muscle stretch reflex and tendon reflexes. These are both initiated or orchestrated by proprioceptors. Let's take a look at those proprioceptors. Here's the muscle spindle that governs the muscle stretch reflex. So within your skeletal muscles, these sensory organs lie. They have some specialized muscle cells called intrafusal fibers wrapped up by sensory neurons. And if the muscle changes length and stretches or shortens these intrafusal fibers, the sensory neuron will either become activated or inactivated, and will get wind of the change of the cerebellum, will get wind of the change in length of the muscle. But there's also a reflex that will be initiated. If a muscle, here's the tonic output. This is a tonic receptor, one that does not adapt and is constantly sending out impulses. So that's what we mean by tonic. And here's the frequency of the sensory neuron output at a particular muscle length in this muscle spindle. If we stretch the muscle or lengthen the muscle, then the sensory neuron will increase in its frequency, and that will tell the cerebellum, oh, the muscle has lengthened. Well, there's a reflex response to that lengthening of the muscle. There's a reflex contraction that takes place. It's thought to be a kind of a postural automation kind of thing, so that if a postural muscle begins to lengthen, it will very quickly be contracted a little bit more. We'll just add to its tension to keep the body posture constant. Well, it turns out that there's one more aspect of a muscle spindle that we can look at. If you imagine the muscle spindle shortening and shortening, right? At first, the sensory neuron would slow down in its frequency of action potentials, but eventually, those intrafusal fibers would be all kind of slack and bunched up, and there would be no further effect of shortening the muscle. There's another motor neuron called a gamma motor neuron. That's supposed to be a Greek letter gamma. I didn't notice the terrible thing that happened with respect to fonts as we changed versions of Microsoft Office. That should be a gamma, Greek letter. So anyway, there's a gamma motor neuron, not just the alpha motor neuron activated in the reflex that controls the skeletal muscle. There's a gamma motor neuron that goes to the muscle spindle itself and shortens up the intrafusal fibers so that they're tense again, so that they can appreciate further shortening. So in other words, if we already saw there's tonic output from this receptor, it will increase in frequency if the muscle lengthens, and if the muscle shortens, it'll slow down its frequency of action potentials. But if it gets to the stopping point, it would have no longer any more function, but it will, because the gamma motor neuron will activate muscle spindle contraction. Then it'll be snugged up again and have some tone, and then further shortening can cause a drop in impulse frequency again. So then we'll have two pieces of data. How much did we have to contract the gamma motor neuron or activate the gamma motor neuron, plus the drop in frequency in the sensory neuron? So just a point about how to increase the range of function of a muscle spindle. So we have a reflex muscle contraction initiated by a muscle spindle lengthening. And not only does the reflex contraction of the muscle take place in the muscle stretch reflex, reciprocal inhibition of the antagonist muscle takes place. So let's take a look. We have a stretching muscle here, a stretching muscle spindle, a proprioceptor. In response, in this case, to a clinical intervention or test, we're going to stretch the muscle by smacking the patellar ligament, which tugs on this quadriceps muscle. Sensory input from the muscle spindle increases and directly activates an alpha motor neuron, which causes the quadriceps group to contract. We have the knee-jerk reflex, it's called. Just a muscle stretch reflex, a specific one. Well, not only that, but let's look at the integration here on the spinal cord. That same sensory neuron activates an interneuron, which produces IPSPs on the motor neuron to the antagonist muscle, inhibits it. So we contract the extensor muscle, or in this case it was an extensor muscle, contract the muscle that was stretched and inhibit the other muscle, the antagonist muscle. That's called reciprocal inhibition. I could have just gone right down through there and let you read it. So if the muscle stretch reflex is absent, it could suggest nervous system injury. It could also suggest a drug on board that's a central nervous system depressant, a neuromodulator that suppresses activity of the nervous system so that the reflex is weakened or dampened. It's also possible that we're missing a hormone. The thyroid hormone is a neuromodulator that controls the metabolic activity of cells in your body, including neurons and the entire nervous system. So if you're hypothyroid, your nervous system is going to be weak and dampened down and sluggish, and you may not see the receptors. So if your patient comes into the clinic complaining about tiredness and chills and gaining weight and so forth and not feeling themselves, and you start to suspect the hypothyroid because the thyroid hormone controls metabolism and energy levels and so forth, and then you do this test and there's an absent reflex, you may then elect to send the patient to an endocrinologist to check it out. The Golgi tendon reflex is initiated by Golgi tendon organs, another type of proprioceptor that tests muscle tension. Tendons, when they're stretched, activate the Golgi tendon reflex by way of Golgi tendon organ activation. They send their information to the cerebellum to adjust muscle tension. It starts to inhibit, causes reflex inhibition of the skeletal muscle contraction or reflex relaxation, so that we will limit the amount of contraction. We're not going to just infinitely keep adding more and more tension to a muscle and a tendon. We're going to start to get into a check and balance system where we're going to limit that amount of tension as it begins to mount. Here's the diagram showing a Golgi tendon organ in the tendon, in this case the organ or the tendon of the quadriceps group, same group we've just been looking at. Tension increases, frequency of action potential increases in the sensory neuron, and what's going to happen? We're going to have IPSPs this time to the quadriceps group inhibit, start to not turn off, but begin to inhibit further contraction force of that muscle group, and also reciprocal activation of the antagonist muscle, the hamstrings in this case. So that's the Golgi tendon reflex. The flexor reflex or withdrawal reflex we also looked at in lab. Let's just go right to the diagram. If you have a noxious stimulus, in this case a surprise grab of the forearm causing it to extend, that noxious stimulus will trigger a reflex contraction of a flexor muscle in that limb or appendage, right? So, or what if we burned our fingertip? It would cause a reflex contraction of the flexor muscles to withdraw that limb from that noxious stimulus, all orchestrated by integration here. We're also going to inhibit the antagonist muscle, in this case the triceps muscle, that's reflex, that reciprocal inhibition, reflexively. There's another part of this reflex called the cross extensor reflex. The same sensory neuron is going to give rise to a reflex activation of extensor muscle in the opposite or contralateral limb. Contralateral means the opposite limb, and we're going to inhibit the flexor muscle in the contralateral limb. Ipsilateral limb to the sensation, contralateral limb. All right. So that's the withdrawal reflex or flexor reflex, as well as the cross extensor reflex. There are also superficial reflexes. The plantar reflex and abdominal reflexes are most famous. We did the plantar reflex in lab, or gave it a whirl. It is the Babinski reflex. We said that stimulating the plantar surface in an adult should elicit flexion of the hallux or big toe, whereas in an infant it should cause extension of the big toe. That's because in an infant the pathway to the cortex, where the reflex is housed, is slower due to incomplete myelination of the neurons, such that a spinal reflex is exhibited in which we have extension of the big toe. The cortical reflex in adults masks that reflex, causing flexion of the big toe. So in an adult, if we see that flexion or the extension of the big toe, we have Babinski's sign. There could be a corticospinal tract lesion or some other spinal cord injury, so that the pathway to the cortex and back is interfered with, and we see the spinal reflex, which infants exhibit, instead of the cortical reflex that adults exhibit. Also, individuals with, I've been on the abdominal reflex. That's all the discussion I meant to apply to this. Babinski's reflex, if an adult exhibits Babinski's sign, it's an indication possibly, as well as in the abdominal reflex, it's an indication that the spinal cord has been interrupted or injured in some way, so that we see the spinal reflex, not the cortical reflex. Same thing with the abdominal reflexes. All right. So that's the end of our discussion. I just took some slides from the cranial nerves. If you're interested in reading more about the cranial nerves, there's slides down here at the bottom of the stack that you can look through. Some wonderful cartoon drawings of the organization of the mapping, anatomical mapping of these nerves.